There we go. Awesome. Thank you. So thanks for coming to our panel presentation on why sex ed for all and why May is no longer Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month. Next slide, please. So this session is brought to you by the Sex Education Collaborative. We represent 24 national, regional, and state-based organizations who have extensive expertise in sex education and sexual and reproductive health for young people, supporting youth-serving professionals to deliver sex ed. At the end of the presentation, we'll share a little bit more about the SEC, including some of the resources we have that may be helpful for you in your work. So we will get back to a little bit more about the SEC. But for now, I'm going to start by letting us all introduce ourselves so you know who you're talking to. Next slide, please. So why don't we go left to right, Diana, if you don't mind going first.
Not at all. Hi, everyone. My name is Diana Tutel Rhodes. I'm the Vice President of Policy Partnerships and Organizing at Advocates for Youth, a national reproductive and sexual health and rights organization that centers the needs and voices of young people while building young people's power to make change in their communities. And I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gina Desiderio. I am the Director of Communications here at Healthy Teen Network, and I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Julia Bennett, she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Digital Education and Learning Strategy at Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And so we are all member organizations of the SEC who worked extensively on this campaign. So we're excited to sort of share with you a little bit more about this observance and sort of how it came to be. So our objectives for today are to identify the stigmatizing and problematic messaging often embedded in teen pregnancy prevention campaigns, to explain the purpose of May as Sex Ed for All Month, to save the date to participate in May 2022 Sex Ed for All Month, and then to identify the resources of the Sex Ed Collaborative to provide support advancing comprehensive, high quality sex ed. So that's a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. So if you still think you're in the right session, glad you're here, and we're excited to talk with you more about all of this. And I'm going to kick it off to Diana to start giving some of that context.
Great, thank you. So just to kick us off, the why, right? Why did we move away from teen pregnancy prevention to sex ed for all in the month of May, right? And why did we kind of shift away from that frame? So, as many of you know, for over 20 years, our field has uplifted May as Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month as a moment to champion the programs and efforts dedicated to adolescent sexual health, and often discussing the decline of teen pregnancy as a part of that conversation. Many of our organizations and yours have uplifted this crucial month to center the amazing work being done in sex education, sexual health services, parent-teen communication, and other efforts that center young people's access to sexual health information and services. And at some point, many of us in the field would use the talking point, Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month is so much more than just teen pregnancy prevention. It's about XYZ, right? All the various pieces that we work on. So as time went on, our field began to shift even the framing of teen pregnancy prevention, recognizing the stigma and shame that framework caused, especially for young people and young parents. And we're going to dive deeper on this point later in the session. And so while we were all saying teen pregnancy prevention is much more than just preventing teen pregnancy, we needed to rebrand and reframe the month to kind of really reflect that. But really, at the end of the day, the shift away from teen pregnancy prevention came because, and can we go to the next slide, please? Because young people demand it, right? And parents want it too. So we know that the majority of young people and parents want more than just teen pregnancy prevention. They want comprehensive quality sex ed. We know that, from some recent research done by Planned Parenthood, that 94% of parents surveyed supported sex ed in middle school, and that number increased to 96% when we talked about high school, right? We know parents support some form of sex ed for young people. And so young people spoke. we listened. We know that calling May Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month stigmatizes young people. And instead, we wanted to stand with young people so that they have the power and the right to access the education and information that they need to achieve the best positive outcomes for their reproductive and sexual health. We know as that young people grow up, they face important decisions about relationships, sexuality, sexual behavior. And we now know that it's not enough for programs to include just discussions of abstinence and contraception to help young people avoid unintended pregnancy or avoid STIs or HIV, right? Comprehensive sex ed must do more, and we must provide young people with honest, age-appropriate information and skills necessary to help young people make healthy decisions about their lives. We also know that sex ed promotes social and emotional competencies that contribute to academic achievement, reduced risk-taking, and healthy relationships. We know this because we have research and evidence to back this up. And the research and evidence comes from all the work that our organizations and your organizations have been doing for decades and talk about during Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month. And because young people have consistently called for increased access to sex ed and information, a few years ago, the organizations that are part of a national coalition that's working and dedicated to improving sexual and reproductive health rights and justice responded to this need in the field, and also this need to rebrand and shift away our framework to rebranding May as Sex Ed for All Month. Seeing as that we don't have young people on this panel right now, and I'm not quite sure who's all in the room, but it's important to hear from young people themselves, right? And so what this video was a quick few-minute video about where we asked high school young folks what their vision for sex ed is and what they're experiencing right now. It's truly incredible. We just give them one prompt and a video camera, and all the pieces that we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the session are all areas that young people share with us consistently about what they want and what they need when it comes to sex ed and when it comes to classroom instruction. And further, if we're going to be making decisions about policies and practices and even curricula that impact young people, we have to be centering their voices and needs in the process.
What we should learn in sex ed is that sex is a natural thing. Your parents did it, that's how you are here. And even our teachers' parents did it, that's how they are here. So stigmatizing it does nothing for us, because what do we learn? We just learn how to judge other people rather than to live our own lives and be happy.
I think that comprehensive sex education should be something in some ways that starts from the beginning of your schooling, whether that be very zoomed out conversations about consent and communication, that when you get to the middle school or high school age and you're sat down to have this sex education, you're not like, oh, communication is a totally new skill to me.
I think sex education, there's a lot that need to be fixed. Personally, I never even had sex education in school, and what I've learned through the programs that I am in is the most that I know. And I think it's important to talk about it, because a lot of people they don't like to talk about it because they're very uncomfortable. And it's important to tell other people of what is going on in the reality and make sure they face the reality as well.
Mm-hmm. They should be taught that sex is not this dangerous thing, and that although it can have, it could have some bad results from it. I think that the way teaching it in an abstinence only manner is just pretty dangerous, because it kind of defines sex in a way as something that's bad. And I think that we should talk about the intersectionality of sex between religion and race and gender.
Also, sex ed for LGBT, and for other people to know about sex ed for LGBT, and especially for trans folks, because I know nothing about that, and I'm kind of sad that I know nothing about that. And I couldn't imagine how it is for trans people who know nothing or who know like little about sex once they've already transitioned, or how everything works.
Okay, so in sex education class, I really like to learn more about the different types of birth controls, like condoms and birth pills aren't the only way. I know there are devices that you can insert or patches, but we don't have enough. I don't know much about those things. I also like to know the human anatomy, what can be done to prevent HIV and STDs, just basic stuff like that. Because in schools, they be like, boys use a condom or don't have sex at all.
But just really wanted to bring young people's voices in the room as we're talking about. And so, you know, the why of it all is that we know that young people demand it, and we know that evidence and research backs us up. We work with young people across the country, and they inform the policies and practices of not only our organization, but, you know, the coalitions and spaces that we work with. And so, you know, we know that young people also not only demand comprehensive sex ed in schools and real accurate information to make healthy decisions, they also demand equity and access, which leads us to not only improve sex ed in the classroom, but also ensure that it's accessible and equitable to all young people. And that's where legislation comes in, right? And so, you know, at Sex Ed for All Month, as we reimagine Sex Ed for All Month, moving away from just teen pregnancy prevention and a frame that, you know, stigmatizes and shames young people, in which we heard repeatedly from the young people we work with. We also, Sex Ed for All Month also affirms our commitment to stand with young people in their call for equity and access to sex ed. And so we are consistently here to offer them support, advocating for comprehensive sex ed. As we talked about earlier, we know an overwhelming majority of people agree that young people in the US should have access to some form of sex ed in their experiences in schools. But unfortunately, too many young people in our nation are not getting the information skills they need. I often get a question from media, which is always a very unsatisfying answer for reporters, which is the question of like, what's the state of sex ed in the US, you know, a policy question. And my very unsatisfying question is, you know, that it's a patchwork of policy and practice across the country, right? We know that there is no one federal program or mandate around sex education. There's federal programs that provide a more comprehensive approach to sex ed and provide funding for various different forms or parts of sex ed that many of you are aware of and might get funding through. There is no national federal standard. And then you get down to the state level. We know that 30 states and DC mandate sex ed, but there's no guarantee that it requires sex ed to be medically accurate or age appropriate or unbiased, right? You can add a few more states that mandate HIV prevention, but even then, the requirements are so vast and varied across the state. And because we know education is such a home rule area of policy, that goes down even further into the local school district level to school by school level. So you can have a young person in a classroom and receive a certain education experience, and their best friend 2 miles away are receiving something very different. And then as they continue to age through their adolescence and go into college and various other spaces, we have young people who are receiving such a wide range of information that sometimes is often laden with stigma and fear and shame. And so we know now that, you know, on a state level, sex ed and other personal rights and health of our young people have been under constant attack, right? And so it's more important than ever to organize against legislation that harms young people from getting the information and care that is vital to their well-being. And this is also another area in which, you know, young people are continually asking. They want better sex ed in their schools, but they also want equitable access. They want all young people to receive equitable information and have access to that information without barriers. And while sex ed is often determined at a state and local level, under the Biden-Harris administration, we're hoping to have a renewed opportunity and urgency to invest in programs that meet the needs of all young people. And so, we'll get to more of that later in this session. But as far as, kind of the beginning parts of why, we know sex ed works, we know it should be equitable and accessible, and we know that young people demand it. I can pause there and pass it to back to Julia to talk a little bit more and dive deeper on some of these pieces.
Thanks, Diana. We can stick with the same slide. So, some of what you already heard in the plenary actually is that, we know that the work that we do around sex education is about so much more than just prevention. And we have an opportunity with this, like having a May, observance around our issues. We have this opportunity to spotlight all of the work we do with young people to support their sexual and reproductive health and wellness. And that this work is about so much more than just preventing pregnancy or STIs. And young people need and have a right to the full spectrum of support around all of these issues so that they can truly thrive, right? So young people have the right to the information and skills they need to protect their health and live their best lives. They deserve age-appropriate, medically accurate information and answers to their questions about sex and relationships free from the shame and stigma that our culture breeds, no matter who they are, where they live, or what their income is. Next slide, please. So, again, you heard some of this actually in the last plenary, so this is good timing. But, so when we thought about the opportunity with this 1 month to highlight the potential for our work, we knew we could do more. And we know sex education can help people have more fulfilling lives and live well. It also has the power to change society and public health for the better. So we decided to embrace a more comprehensive and robust approach, including the wide range of topics comprehensive sex education covers. So this includes things like teaching about healthy relationships, communication, and consent, which is partially about prevention of things like abuse or intimate partner violence, but it's also about helping young people learn the skills they need to have fulfilling relationships with all of the people in their lives, not just potential future intimate partners or current intimate partners, but all the people in their lives, because we know sex ed is teaching so many elements around friendships and family relationships and all of this. So there's huge potential in just how we relate to people. There's, teaching about the full spectrum of sexual orientations and gender identities, which can help both young people grow into their most authentic self, but also help all people celebrate the diversity of identities, preferences, and experiences, contributing to a more equitable society. So this identity formation and celebration piece, right? Teaching about ownership of your own body, which we often call bodily autonomy, and how to advocate for yourself can bring up a generation of young people who are better equipped to access and fight for the respect, the resources, and the healthcare that they deserve. And pleasure and intimacy. So teaching about pleasure and intimacy can help create a society that doesn't shame people, particularly women and femmes, for their sex, gender, or sexuality. And teaching about media literacy, critical thinking, and systemic oppression can help the next generation understand how power functions in their lives and in our society more broadly, so they can fight for justice for themselves and others, particularly those who are the most marginalized. So there's this huge potential that we know sex education, if taught in a comprehensive way, can have. And so we wanted to leverage that better with this month of May and to really show people the full potential of the work that we do. And so I'm going to pass it now to Gina.
Thank you, Julia. And so the other part of the reason in making this transition is that we're committed to being inclusive and affirming. And a message about teen pregnancy prevention is just not that. If you reflect back to what Vanessa talked about in the opening session about how are we dishonoring young people and their families? What value statements or judgments are we making? And how are we stigmatizing? They may be young parents themselves. What are we saying about their mothers, their fathers, their grandparents? The problem with teen pregnancy prevention is that it is stigmatizing and shaming, and it's definitely not inclusive and affirming. Before moving to Sex Ed for All Month, we saw this rise in advocacy efforts grounded in reproductive justice. This call to attention for these shaming and stigmatizing messages. In 2013, a diverse group of young mothers from across the United States, they founded No Teen Shame. Their mission is to improve policy and eradicate the stigma that negatively impacts young parents' access to quality healthcare, education, and community support. You can see the campaigns and the initiatives from California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. They have their Justice for Young Families initiative. In 2016, they were then called Young Women United. Now they're Bold Futures New Mexico. They published a report, Dismantling Teen Pregnancy Prevention. And that goes through step-by-step discrediting the myths that are regularly perpetuated by teen pregnancy prevention models. I'm not going to go very deeply into these myths, but we just want to go across the surface because really explaining why the teen pregnancy prevention message is problematic. I'll quickly share the myth. I'll share an image that reinforces that myth, and then just an image that we've seen in the past from some of these groups to contrast that shaming message. These are very negative images that I'm about to show, so I just want to put that out there. Typically, we don't like to continue to show those images, but here we're showing them for that contrast and just to show why we felt there was such a definite need to move away from Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month. So next slide, please. So here you've got a 2013 New York City Department of Social Services PSA. Got a good job. I cost thousands of dollars each year. Expected to spend more than $10,000 a year to raise a child. And of course, the unspoken message to the taxpayers is that we're going to shoulder the cost. We should be blaming young parents. And so embedded in most teen pregnancy prevention campaigns, models, programs is this myth that teen parents are drained on the government resources. They're costing taxpayers money. The reality is that these so-called social costs, they're inaccurately attributed to young parents. Really, we have to look at poverty, systemic poverty, pre-existing conditions. Blaming young parents, that just fails to identify the systemic inequalities and the resulting disparities. Go ahead and click that again for the next slide. We've got a different image here from Justice for Young Families. I know it hasn't changed yet. If you just hit, there we go. Just an image from the Justice for Young Families campaign from California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. Like all families, young parents need support. It's a myth that it's just young parents who need support, but it's true that it's hard to be a young family, whether you are an adolescent parent or not an adolescent parent, and that all parents need support in raising their children. Next slide, please. So here we've got another New York City campaign. I'm twice as likely not to graduate high school because you had me as a teen. Kids of teen moms are twice as likely not to graduate than kids whose moms are over age 22. And again, what we're seeing here is this myth perpetuating the belief that young parents, they're the ones that we should be blaming for the consequences of poverty and systemic inequities. What we know really is that the age someone becomes a parent is not a determining or predictive factor for them or their children's future. And for some young people, that decision to be a parent, to become a parent, may be a rational one given their economic and environmental circumstances. And what we've seen is that in some communities, young parenting may be a protective factor against low birth weight and infant mortality, for example. And so we've got this other contrasting image of I received motivation to succeed from my daughter. Next slide. We've got another one. This is from the DC campaign. It was from 2011. I'm not a doll. I'm forever be a kid. Don't have one. What we know is that parenting or not, many adolescents in the United States are caretakers. They're carrying financial responsibilities for themselves, for their families, for their siblings. And that most adolescent mothers in reality are over the age of 18. So this myth that young parents are babies having babies is also inaccurate. Contrasting that message, we have this artwork from the Repeal Hide Act, or the Repeal Hide Art Project, stating, "You deserve to be treated with dignity, kindness, and respect, no matter at what age you choose to parent. Justice for young parents is reproductive justice." So when you're saying that teen parents are babies having babies, you're I can never say that word, infantilizing young parents. And it's a way that you're laying foundation to take away their rights as parents and also their right to respect and dignity, same as for everyone. So this last example, you've got the Candies Foundation campaign where there's the message, you're supposed to be changing the world, not changing diapers. So the subtext is you've ruined your life by having this baby. Yet for many young parents, what they report back is that by having a child, they were more motivated to finish school, or that becoming a parent has helped them to be more responsible and focused. So it actually was not something that ruined their lives. And we've got an image here from No Teen Shame. I am not a mistake or a public health issue. I am a girl. I am a human. I am awesome because my mom gave me life at 17, but gives me love and purpose every day. So I've very quickly run through these points. They are much more thoroughly examined in that Dismantling Teen Pregnancy report from Bold Futures, New Mexico. It's just that quick run through of why these messages about teen pregnancy prevention can be so isolating, so stigmatizing, and problematic. Coming from Healthy Teen Network, where we were founded in 1979 as a national organization on adolescent pregnancy and parenting, our roots are in supporting the professionals who work with young parents. We later added a third P to that name for prevention. And we would often hear this pushback of, you can't talk about prevention when you're talking about young parents and vice versa. And that again is going back to that value-laden assumption that there's a problem with teen pregnancy. And of course, when you have comprehensive sex ed, then you are being inclusive and affirming for all young people. And that's what Sex Ed for All is all about. So let's talk about that month. I'm going to transition back to Diana, and she's going to give you a little bit of preview.
Yeah, thank you. So what does Sex Ed for All Month look like in the past? As we were saying earlier, a few years ago, national organizations came together to really shift that frame. And in order to do that, there were kind of some steps to really kind of launch Sex Ed for All Month. And so, one way to do that was we passed in each Congress. Now we are introducing and passing a federal resolution that calls for May as Sex Ed for All Month to really give congressional direction and administrative direction, right? On May being Sex Ed for All Month, and using those values-based statements on why sex ed is so important, why inclusive, affirming sex ed is important, and why equity and access is so important. We've also, during that time, the last few years, we've introduced legislation, the Real Education and Access for Healthy Youth Act, which is a piece of federal legislation that calls for and provides, not only comprehensive sex ed language from the federal government, but also programs that fund comprehensive approaches to sex ed that is inclusive, that is culturally responsive, that includes conversations on consent and healthy relationships. And so we've used May, Sex Ed for All Month, as a hook and a time to have these conversations and to introduce legislation to continue to build champions of support at a federal level. We've also held congressional briefings with our champions on the Hill and experts to really, continue that conversation and really push and do our advocacy to push for, the cultural conversation around sex ed as well as the policy conversation. And as always, centering the youth, the voices and needs of young people. Each year, we also, work to have a youth town hall and have a space where young people share what it is that they want and need from sex ed and some of the advocacy work they're doing in their communities to push for more comprehensive sex ed at their schools or in their states. Last year, we had a panel of state legislators and sex education experts speak to what was happening at the state level, right? We know that sex ed has so many different layers when it comes to the federal policy space, the state policy space, and then obviously with local education and state education agencies and community-based organizations. And so, past events have included a list of these, various things I just mentioned, as well as other ways for the field writ large to engage and really uplift the amazing work that you all are doing and that we're doing with young people to better serve young people. Go to the next slide and pass it to Oh, actually, yeah. And so just a little bit of examples here. Part of the work we did with state legislators last year was really, focusing in on the state level and, getting as much buy-in as we could. And so we had some state legislators, provide quotes and also share on a panel why it is that it's so important in their state. So we can see here, Florida Representative Anna Escamani, who did some work on a state sex ed policy in Florida, share that age-based, equitable, and accessible sex ed programming for our young people is essential to our collective health and resilience, creating a nation and state where young people are informed and empowered to make healthy decisions benefits us all, and we should be committed to expanding access to sex ed today and every day. If we can go to the next slide. And we have a representative from Massachusetts, Jack Lewis, share that when sex ed is LGBTQ inclusive, it helps to create safe and affirming environments for LGBTQ young folks to learn about consent and healthy relationships. Such education provides vital tools to aid youth in making informed decisions. Furthermore, inclusive curricula reduces bullying by teaching respect and enhances the ability of all students to learn. And so part of our kind of work with Sex Ed for All Month was really to, try to get as much buy-in as we could from those who are in the field implementing programs around sex ed or adolescent sexual health, as well as decision makers at the state and federal levels to really champion and push forward more comprehensive approaches and policies to sex ed. Next slide, please. I'll pass it on to my colleague Julia to talk a little bit more.
So in terms of the nuts and bolts of what we actually, as a collaborative, put together for Sex Ed for All Month for folks in the field to use, we put together a toolkit listing all of the events that we were going to be hosting and a suggested calendar for events that organizations in the field could do. We had an email announcement template, a news release template, talking points, graphics and social media posts. We had some creative and collateral that folks could use as well. So if you go to the next slide, we have a few examples. So this is some of the creative that we put together for Sex Ed for All Month this past year. So you can see that it, sorry, hold on a second. In developing the look and feel, our goal was to have a concrete values-based tone and message that people can really advocate for. We wanted people to feel called to action and educated about the importance of sex education. So as the slide says, the quality of your sex education shouldn't be based on your zip code. Sex Ed for All Month calls for comprehensive reform and tangible resources for all young people, no matter where they live. Next slide. So here's another example of an asset we developed with youthful visuals and bold messaging on the full spectrum of potential for sex education. These are the types of materials that were part of our toolkit, so all of us doing work throughout the observance could have a clear, consistent message for all of our diverse audiences, which sort of helps us get the attention of folks. If we're all saying the same thing, we're all committed to using the same messaging, it can really help us organize across the country with the communications that we're doing. And I'm going to pass it to Gina.
Thank you. So that's the background in where we came from, why we evolved from Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month to Sex Ed for All Month. And so our request to you, or our ask to you, is if you haven't already been recognizing Sex Ed for All Month, if you're ready to join us, or if you've been doing events in the past, what might you do next year? And what might you need to do to prepare? Is this a big step or a small step for your organization? And what might be some preparatory steps? And what might be some things that the Sex Ed Collaborative could do to help you for 2022? And so to have that conversation, we're going to do that in breakout groups. So these are the questions in your groups that we'll ask you to just go through. What have you done in the past in May? What might you want to do for May 2022? And what might you need to do to support those activities? Are there things you could do now to get ready? Are there key stakeholders, for example, you need to educate or get on board for this new framing? Are there partners, maybe even some non-typical partners, and thinking about how how widespread the effects or the benefits of sex ed are that might want to join you in these efforts. So those are the questions. We're going to give you about 5 minutes in your breakout groups, and then we're going to come back together. And we ask that you can also be prepared to share. We'll ask you to just share some comments in the chat when you come back. So it looks like people are coming back into our room. I know that was a short little bit to talk. We did want to give that space. We also want to make sure that we save time at the end for any questions that you may have. But if you could start sharing in the chat, what were some things that came up in your discussion, or what might be some challenges or things that could be helpful for you if you wanted to move to recognizing and celebrating sex ed for all month? What might be helpful for you? I see one person put, what would be helpful language to use with funders to get them to shift away from teen pregnancy prevention? We see that a lot. I know Vanessa talked about that in the language, and like the proposals, they ask you to talk about the statistics and to talk about it from a deficit. And so that is so difficult. Just sharing from some of our personal experience with Healthy Teen Network on our projects. We do have some projects with the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program. And so we're doing our best to work from within. One of the things that we do is we talk to our project officer. We have an advisory group, and we bring to them the findings, the calls from our advisory group that they want more than just teen pregnancy prevention. And so far, we've found that our project officer has been very supportive of that and how we talk about things, and shifting away from language that can be harmful. And that goes beyond just Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month, but also talking about those terms like Vanessa called out, like disadvantaged youth, minority youth. Language is a constant topic for us in this one project. Some other things that we're seeing, confusion around federal agencies, OPA, HHS still recognizing Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month. That was definitely something we talked about.
I can hop
Diana, you
in
want to say
there
something?
real quick? Yeah,
Thank you.
Definitely in the last few years, federal agencies having various different messages and still focusing on Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month definitely was a thing. And we all know that federal agencies are these behemoths that sometimes are different arms not talking to one another. And, you know, those of us who work in some more the federal policy space in DC have been, with the new administration, having those conversations with the various agencies and are really trying to prime HHS, within that OPA and OAH and Division of Adolescent School Health, DASH over at CDC, to really uplift sex ed for all month, and have explained that shift under the previous administration was a little bit more difficult. And so we're hoping that 2022, the federal agencies will be more coordinated in their, for May as Sex Ed for All Month this year.
Thank you all for continuing to share. I'm gonna ask if you want to continue to put comments in there, or if you want to put questions in there so that we can get to those, the question and answer. What we want to share with you first before we move there, though, is resources that are available to you now. I see like a comment from Jen and talking about the sex ed standards. That's absolutely important. That's one of the resources that you can access right now with the Sex Ed Collaborative. And Sam, thank you for that, sharing your screen again. So first thing, if you want to get updates, if you want to know what's happening with Sex Ed for All Month, we encourage you to go to that link right there for the Sex Ed Collaborative about /back/contact. You can sign up for updates. And so when there is new information about Sex Ed for All Month, you'll be sure to get that. Then the next slide, also on the Sex Ed Collaborative, if you're looking for training across the host of standards for sex ed, then definitely check out the training hub on the Sex Ed Collaborative. And so what you'll find there is that it brings together the national, regional, and state-based sex ed professional training, TA, policy support for K through 12 in schools, all in one place. So this is the Sex Ed Collaborative members across the board, across the United States. And it makes it easy for you to search. You could search for topics by training, right, training top, you could search for trainings by topic, by location, by grade level, and they all map to the professional learning standards for sex ed. These are standards that were developed by the Sex Ed Collaborative to help improve educators' ability to effectively teach about family life and sexuality with their K through 12 students. And these were informed by the National Sex Education Standards, which are also endorsed by the Sex Ed Collaborative. And there's a lot of other different resources on the Sex Ed Collaborative website. We've got some quick tips in terms of like teaching virtually, how you can revive your sex ed. There's an editorial from some of our members on how sex ed has the power to bring about social change. And so that is just a good starting place if you're looking for more resources as you're waiting for more information about Sex Ed for All Month. If you're looking for help, for example, in talking to stakeholders and how you want to transition to this frame, that would be a great starting point. And so with that, I just want to open it up to questions and what we can elaborate on, answer for you. If you want to share those in chat, we can go through those.
I actually see from all the comments, there's a question sort of buried a little bit in here around, I'd love to know what event formats have been successful. Sex Ed for All Month would be new for our area of Maryland, and framing would be important. I feel like Diana, you might be a good person to answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, as far as formats, and make sure I understand the question correctly, you know, if folks have done work around Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month, it's a good, in previous, you know, iterations, it's a good place to start, right? Like what worked previously in your community to really uplift the work. And really, I think the best thing with the frame of Sex Ed for All is that you can really kind of uplift what's most important in that umbrella that is relevant to your community, right? And so there were some organizations who really centered around HIV education or healthy teen parent communication, right? Whatever programs that you're working on or that are the most relevant for your community, have those be the pieces that you uplift, right? You can use as many of the kind of messaging or language that have been created, but I think tailoring it to what works best for you in Maryland or wherever you're at, and especially the programs. Even I think our organizations during Sex Ed for All Month really uplifted our specific work, right? Whether it's the National Sex Ed Standards, whether it's you know, an evidence-based intervention that your organization, you know, implements in schools, really kind of uplifting that. I think what has been helpful and what we've seen, of course, like the last couple of years have been in a pandemic, so who knows what works anymore or what, but in the virtual space, you know, which has been helpful to really, you know, increase accessibility, right? Like more people can kind of jump into these panels and conversations than maybe in-person stakeholder or community-based roundtables or tabling at events, you know? So I think having folks who are experts on some of the issues that are going on in your community, as well as like young people themselves, and focusing on you know, young people need access to information around STIs or HIV or consent, and really having young people speak to that has also been helpful. Our youth town hall was really well attended and really well received. And really also what helps as far as format goes is to record those sessions and then continually like kind of uplift those video clips or quotes or whatnot from those sessions throughout the month, right? To continue the conversation going. And if you're doing digital work, right, to, you know, continue that hook of conversation for the entire month to uplift the various different parts of your program that you are, you know, speaking to. I don't know if Julia or Gina have other thoughts on that.
I don't.
All right, I was just sharing the link, and I see it did not go through in the chat, but if you wanted to check out what the youth town hall looked like, we've got the link for that. Putting that in here. there that time. So that's, and I just got to that from the Sex Ed Collaborative page on Sex Ed for All Month. I think in looking at the comments about like being cautious because of the climate in your community, that it's starting where you are and moving forward in what's possible and bringing in the people that are your champions. And are those the parents who are supportive of that? What youth are engaged and interested in moving this forward in your community and working with them as the advocates to build that support, and that you can get there slowly. It doesn't have to be a radical change all at once, but that you could be moving in the right direction, and that's what's right for a community, then that's a good fit for you.
I also see a few comments that are sort of around this idea of explaining what sex education is and what it looks like at different ages, and around sort of concerns in, you know, like talking to programs that work with middle or elementary school young people and sort of thinking about all that. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for all of us to do a better job of messaging what that looks like, because most people in this country didn't get sex ed, right? Or if they got it, it's like the classic condom on a banana and talking about periods. And so they don't, you know, of course people don't have a concept of what we mean when we talk about sex ed. And so that's definitely something we can think about going into next year is how do we leverage the month to help educate people about what we mean when we say sex ed, and, you know, what are the building blocks for a first grader that can then lead up to teaching a senior in high school, and like sort of how those building blocks show up, just like they do for math or for English, right? So that's definitely something we can keep in mind as we go into next year and thinking about how we can message that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna, if you can, Sam, advance the slides to the final one where it's got our email, our contact information. We'll leave that one up. So we've still got a minute or two if you want to drop a question, but in the meantime, just want to say thank you all for joining us, for being open to hearing about Sex Ed for All Month. Our contact information is up there on the slide. You can download a copy of the slides from the Conference Hub. Thank you so much for joining, for sharing in your small breakout groups as well as with us. And I'll see you the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.